All right, good morning, economics students. This is your lecture number 2 for Monday, April 27th. Last lecture we talked about monopolies and cartels. This chapter we're going to be looking at kind of the checkered history of what government has tried to do over the course of about over 100 years of trying to regulate monopolies and cartels. And the bottom line up front is that there's I think it's fair to say unintended consequences of antitrust legislation. So there's this kind of original rationale for particular laws that are put on the books, but what ends up happening is basically the law ends up protecting the same industries that they were designed to actually regulate. So that's the topic for today. It's a little bit longer chapter. This is chapter 8, and so there's really two kind of major topics. There's regulation, so they're going to look at how regulatory agencies behave and function. We'll be introducing the whole idea of capture theory. That what ends up happening is that the firm that's supposed to be regulated captures the government agency, and the government agency ends up protecting from competition the firm that they were designed to try to reduce in power so as to prevent them from acting like a monopoly. And what do monopolies do? They set high prices and reduce the quality of goods. So all of this is about protecting the consumer because in a competitive market system where supply and demand, consumer demand and supplier sovereignty would actually set the price themselves without the government kind of intervening. We've talked about the fact that sometimes monopolies do exist, that there sometimes is a need for government to step in, but the most of the history of antitrust legislation has actually been almost the opposite of what it was intended to do. So that'll be the topic for today's lecture. All right, so the first thing that he does, this is starting on page 154, is Sowell defines and describes the origins of regulation and antitrust in the United States. It's a pretty basic purpose. The purpose of these regulatory agencies was to regulate the prices set by monopolies and cartels. So you could, because basically the government comes in and says, well, this is where the price is because there's a monopoly. What would the price be normally in a competitive marketplace? And then they would try to set the price accordingly. So that was one way, one action that they would take. The other action would be kind of punitive legal action. So a lot of antitrust, a lot of antitrust enforcement has to do with firms that believe that they have been wronged by a monopolistic actor, and then the courts end up enforcing fines and adjudicating disputes between particular firms. So there's really punitive legal action where the monopoly is fined for behavior that is anti-competitive. So there's a couple big pieces of legislation that got passed in the late 19th century, in the 1880s and 1890s. You had the Interstate Commerce Act, Interstate Commerce Commission set up, and that was designed particularly to regulate the monopolies of railroads. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act was another piece of legislation that was designed to get at other trusts like steel and oil. So you had, like in the case of telephones, it said that the American Telephone and Telegraph Company had a monopoly of long distance service, and the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, they actually set the prices that AT&T could charge customers. I'm old enough to remember that there were no cell phones, and that you would have to pay the price that AT&T set, and those prices were set by the FCC. And the typical, if you wanted to make a long distance phone call, you made the call on Saturday and Sunday before 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, prices got jacked up significantly. Um, and so, and then there were state regulatory commissions that were actually designed to enforce prices established for local calls, and those were state agencies. These antitrust laws were intended to allow businesses to operate without the kinds of detailed government supervision which exist under regulatory commissions, but with a sort of general surveillance. So, in other words, they weren't kind of you know peering or peeking over the shoulders of companies, but if a violation occurred and it was brought to their attention, then a specific violation of law would then trigger usually legal action. So that's kind of how it was supposed to work. But current antitrust law is much more complicated. So again, to review, um, the real purpose of these regulatory agencies is to regulate prices set by monopolies and cartels, and also to enforce legal action in the form of fines if the monopoly continue to do its actions. There was major legislation that was passed, the ICC and the Sherman Antitrust Act, and these laws were designed to intervene only after a specific violation of the law would occur. But current antitrust law is much more complicated, and unfortunately, is not really effective in actually busting up monopolies, but it has been used by other firms to kind of go after companies that are actually pretty competitive and are offering lower prices than what the competitors. So it's an inverse of what the purpose of antitrust is to uh, shut monopolies down that usually charge high prices. Most antitrust cases involve competitors going after the big boy that actually has lower prices. So we'll talk about that. The most famous recent antitrust case has to do with Microsoft, but I predict that there's actually going to be some cases involving Google and Facebook in the near future. And it'll be very interesting to see how that works out. Now, on page 155, Sowell goes into what a regulatory commission is. And so, by the nature of the name, it's a government body. These are these independent regulatory agencies that we learned about in civics class. So, ordinarily or ideally, they would set a price for a product or a service that they believe would have been the price if there had been competition. So, it seems rather simple, but here's the problem. What would a price be if there was a competitive marketplace? You have to kind of do a lot of guesswork when it comes to that because you got to eventually determine what the costs of production are for a particular um, product. And so he actually goes into the example of electricity. So this was something that was a typical service and product that would call out for regulation, particularly because most monopolies occur when there's high fixed capital costs. And so laying telephone and telegraph line, how about fiber optic cables today? That takes a lot of expense, and so sometimes those costs prevent other firms coming in and competing with them. And as a result, sometimes they would say that the government would need to come in and actually say, all right, you can't set the price with a kind of an arbitrary high price because you don't have any competition. Where would it be? But you'd have to determine what the costs of production are. So anyway, he goes into the example of electricity, and he points out that often when you are using electricity, the costs are higher at peak use when other people are actually demanding that product, as opposed to maybe using electricity late at night when less people are actually using it. So those costs vary not only in terms of when you use it, but then there are, electricity is generated from multiple energy sources, And those sources, those commodities, can often be used for different purposes. Remember, the whole idea of the study of economics is the allocation of scarce resources with alternative uses. So if you think about energy, um, oil, gas, coal, nuclear, since all these fuels are used for other things besides generating electricity, it's the bottom of 156, the fluctuating demand for these fuels from other industries or for use in homes or automobiles makes their prices unpredictable. But if you're a government agency and you're setting the price, just like when we talked about price controls, or socialist economies where they didn't have the price system determining what it would actually be, it's very, very difficult for the government to actually do it. Now, that doesn't mean that that might not be better than allowing the monopoly to set the price. What he's saying, though, is that it's easier said than done. Another problem with this entire situation is that often what happens is that a firm, let's say a big company like PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, you've got California regulatory commissions that are designed to kind of put a lid on uh, how much PG&E can charge for the production of electricity and other forms of energy. But what happens is that the um, the firm actually, through a long-standing relationship with these regulatory commissions, ends up manipulating the relationship. And so what they call this capture theory, and there's a big danger in having a firm capture the regulatory agency. And the result is that instead of low prices, there's actually a government almost like collusion to prevent prices from going lower than what they actually should be, and uh, increasing barriers to entry for other firms to actually come in and compete. On page 158, Sol writes that the net result of these asymmetrical outside interests on these agencies is that commissions set up to keep a given firm or industry within bounds for the benefit of consumers often metamorphoses into agencies seeking to protect the existing regulated firms from threats from new firms with new technology or new organizational methods. So, one example of this, a classic example, was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was originally set up to keep the railroads from jacking up prices, particularly for farmers on those branch routes, uh, uh, where you would not go from big city to big city, but from a big city to a small town. Well, after a while, the railroads got established kind of a cozy relationship with the Interstate Commerce Commission. And so they ended up lobbying them to actually establish regulations that would make it difficult for other competitors, not just in railroads, but other forms of transportation, from actually being able to enter the market, and then um, having to limit the kind of prices that they could charge. So, in actuality, it was saying that trucking, which is the new competition for railroads in the early 20th century, ended up having to kind of go through a bunch of regulatory hoops in order to actually prove that they were safe and all of these other restrictions. And so the railroad companies received from Congress broader authority under the Motor Carrier Act of 1935 to restrict the activities of truckers. This allowed railroads to survive under the new economic conditions, despite truck competition that was more efficient for various kinds of freight hauling, particularly freight hauling from these local towns. It just was cheaper, particularly when gas was cheap, for people to truck their goods and services on highways. And then, of course, the government gets into the business of building interstate highways. Now, this happens in the 1950s after World War II, and so you get a shift. But for a while, the Interstate Commerce Commission really imposed barriers on trucking. And it said that trucks' activities would have to serve, quote, the public convenience and necessity as defined by the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this kept truckers from driving railroads into bankruptcy by taking away as many of their customers as they could have in an unregulated market. Now, eventually, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, beginning with the Carter administration and really kind of taking off with Reagan, um, the ICC was deregulated, and trucking overall was deregulated, and the result was kind of a boom in trucking, a boom in um, alternative products being brought to market, and the result was much, much lower prices for consumers. Um, and so on page 159, he writes, after the ICC powers to control the trucking industry were eventually reduced by Congress in 1980, freight charges for goods declined substantially, and customers reported a rise in the quality of the service. This was made possible by greater efficiency in the industry, as there are now fewer trucks driving around empty, and more truckers hired workers whose pay was determined by supply and demand rather than by union contracts. And so you still had some anomalies where it actually was cheaper to ship jeans from Taiwan to Dallas as opposed from Dallas to El Paso within the state of Texas. So that gives you an idea of some of the distortions of the actual price system. Um, and then you also had an example in the with the Civics Aeronautic Board, which was a commission that would regulate the airline industry. What ended up happening there is that big um, airlines like TWA, which of course is now defunct, United Airlines, and a couple of others captured the Civics Aeronautic Board and created a whole bunch of unrealistic standards that new companies would have to meet in order to compete and enter the market. And the result was higher costs and lower services. And really, I mean, when I was a kid, flying was only for the very, very rich. Nobody that I knew really flew. Even people who actually made a pretty decent living. It was really for the super and the ultra rich. But I actually saw when I went off to college, this was 1984, 1985, the beginnings of this deregulation of the airlines industry. There was an airline called People's Express, and you started to wonder, okay, is this a fly-by-night operation? But being able to fly for less than $100, for a one way, and sometimes maybe it was 150 round trip. I mean, this was something that was just unheard of in the 1960s and 1970s. So another example of where deregulation actually allowed for cheaper prices and better services. So just to review, you have these regulatory commissions with the primary purpose of setting prices as if competition existed. The problem is it's easier said than done. Very difficult to determine sometimes what the actual costs of production are. And so he gives the example of the difficulty in both California and India of setting electricity prices because there are so many factors. And then he talks about the danger of capture theory when a regulated company captures the regulatory agency that it's supposed to control, and the result is that instead of lower prices, there are actually restrictions on lowering the price to a certain rate, and there are increased barriers to entry. So these bigger companies end up able to set higher prices and not fear any kind of competition. And so, just talked about some of the examples of capture theory. So this is the Interstate Commerce Commission, where the railroad industry captured the ICC, and for a long, long time, really from the 1930s to the 1980s, prevented trucking from actually really taking off. But when it was deregulated in the 1980s, the result was lower prices, better competition, better services. Another example was the Civics Aeronautic Board, where airlines, big airlines, actually prevented smaller firms from entering the market. Once you had deregulation in the early 1980s, you had an explosion of air traffic and air travel options. The irony is that the original rationale for regulation was to keep prices from rising, but then it's only until deregulation that prices actually fell. So again, the irony that it was regulation that was keeping prices high and not low. So that's the first section there, which is regulatory agencies. Now, the second half of the chapter deals with antitrust laws, and again, the same kind of um, uh, dynamic is involved as opposed to like these regulatory commissions. So here, most of the actions in the courts, and so these laws were passed, and then what it would do is it would allow other firms to sue companies if they were quote unquote engaged in anti-competitive practices. And so this is it's Congress passing the law, but the real activity happens in the courts. Whereas the regulatory commissions, things like the ICC and the Civil Aeronautics Board, the Federal Communication Commission, these are administrative agencies, really, kind of quasi Congress, quasi president. We talked a little bit about, how some of the problems there in terms of accountability. But here, this is the realm particularly of the courts. But you have the same kind of problem. There's an original rationale for the legislation, an original rationale for the courts intervening, and it's to basically to prevent monopolies from forming, because when they do form, they have non-competitive pricing, which hurts consumers and hurts the quality of goods. But the reality is that most of these legal cases involve businesses that weren't charging high prices, but that were actually charging lower prices. Now, there's going to be an argument that gets made there about, well, maybe they're charging lower prices now, but it's all part of kind of a scheme in order to kind of capture the market later. Um, and so one thing that Sowell makes very, very clear is that there's a difference between competition and competitors. And this is on page 161. He says, the most important thing about competition is that it is a condition in the marketplace. So to say that something is competitive means that there is a climate in which various firms can enter and leave the market on their own accord, and that this kind of supply and demand process is able to work its will. That's different. A competitive condition is different than having a number of competitors in a given industry at a given time. And so it's not a question of limiting competitors or increasing competitors. It's a question of whether a state or a condition of competition does it exist in the first place. And that is a subjective call. But if you get it wrong, or if you view antitrust legislation just about, well, some kind of arbitrary number about how many competitors should there be in a particular market. I mean, let's say it's a new market, it's a new product. Computers originally come to mind. Maybe in the initial stage of this industry, maybe there are only really one or at the most two firms. Now, there could be a danger eventually of them not only securing kind of a monopoly, but then actually carrying it through. But what Sowell would say is that, hey, you got to wait for them to actually act in a monopolistic way, as opposed to acting before they do with the fear, oh, well, if we don't do anything, then they'll eventually become a monopoly. So you would think that antitrust legislation would be enforced, or cases would be brought before the courts, or firms would be suing because, here's this Microsoft and they're charging these exorbitant rates. Well, the problem was in the case of the famous Microsoft case, Netscape, that wanted to use its operating system on Microsoft's computers, they were charging a higher price than Microsoft's Windows programs. But the courts ended up ruling in favor of Netscape as opposed to Windows. Now, I'm a Mac guy, but the point uh, is anyone ever heard of Netscape since then? Not really, because it kind of went out of business. And so sometimes, just because you have a large firm that is providing a service or a product that might be new onto the market, doesn't mean that they're actually acting in a non competitive, monopolistic way. So Sol would basically say, hey, you got to wait for a case to actually be real, as opposed to just being worried that potentially Microsoft might engage in monopolistic behavior. So again, there's a difference between a condition of competition and the number of competitors. And often it is potential of a monopoly that is prosecuted and not the actual monopoly itself. And so this is a big, big problem for antitrust laws. Um, Everyone, I think, is under supports the original rationale, is just to prevent monopolies from forming and to stop anti-competitive pricing. But the reality is that most antitrust cases have involved businesses that were charging lower prices. There's a difference between a condition of competition and the number of competitors. Typical cases today usually deal with, oh, well, there's not enough competitors in the market, so eventually you might get a monopoly. But often it is the potential of monopoly that is prosecuted, and not actual monopolistic behavior in its of itself. So when he's talking about, for example, anti-competitive pricing, um, he points out that sometimes big firms can provide what's called economies of scale, which means that they can actually bargain with other producers to have lower prices for particular goods. They might have a better transportation and distribution system. Excuse me. That will lower prices more than maybe a smaller firm, and that there's kind of this predictability in the supply chain that a larger company might have. And so you think about your Walmarts or your Targets. Why is it that those prices are cheaper in those stores? And some of it, in my opinion, has to do with where those products are getting made. And I think there is a situation where maybe it's better for the consumer, but if we're not making anything in this country, particularly goods and services that are important for national defense and things of that nature, then maybe there are things that trump just basic economic efficiency. But with that said, it's almost a miracle, some of these products that you can buy at these stores at the prices that they have, not just because they're made in China, but also because these larger companies are able to exact kind of concessions that end up benefiting consumers. So this is on page 163. He says a producer of towels or toothpaste has innumerable alternate buyers and was under no compulsion to sell to A&P in the past, or Target or Walmart today. Only if the economies of scale make it profitable to supply a large buyer with towels or toothpaste or other products will the supplier find it advantageous to cut the price below what would otherwise be charged. All economic transactions involve mutual accommodation, and each transactor has to make the deal a net benefit to the other transactor in order to have a deal at all. In other words, this is a delicate process whether you can actually bring a good or a service to market and make sure that you're not setting at a price that you're not going to be able to recoup the costs of production. So he goes into some examples of antitrust cases that really weren't antitrust cases. So he talks about Morton Salt Company in the 1940s. They were sued for giving discounts to buyers who bought carloads, lots of their products. Businesses that bought less than a carload was charged $1.60 a case. Those who bought carloads of $1.50 a case, and those who bought a lot of carloads were charged with $1.35. So there was this worry that, oh, they're cornering the market, and therefore they will eventually end up jacking up the price after they drive everybody out of competition. The problem is that did Morton Salt do that kind of activity? Not when they were sued, but then the courts would actually find in favor of the people that were suing Morton Salt Company. And so you really were never really allowed to see whether Morton Salt was actually going to engage in actual monopolistic um, behavior. Other examples, Standard Oil in the 1950s, the Borden Milk Company in the 1960s. Um, and so one of the complaints that Sol makes on page 164 is that, in our legal system you're kind of innocent until proven guilty, but in a lot of antitrust cases, it the person bringing the suit only has to prove what's called a prima facie case, basically a superficial or based on gross numbers. And what happens is that the burden of proof then shifts not from the person that's making the accusation, but the person who's being accused of the actual behavior. So instead of being innocent until proven guilty, a lot of these companies are guilty until they can prove themselves innocent. And that was a classic example in the case of Microsoft, where the cases ended up starting in Europe and moving to the United States. And sometimes these legal cases take a long, long time to develop. And so also points out that sometimes by the time the case gets to court after 5, 6, 7 years, the original circumstance of the market actually has changed. And so maybe Microsoft did have a quote unquote, a monopolistic position within the market, which by the way they hadn't manipulated or taken advantage of. But by the time the case gets to court, maybe the entire circumstance has changed. And that doesn't really, they don't account for that in a lot of these cases. Other examples, a Kodak film company. There was a shoe company that actually was charged with being a monopoly that that had less than 7% of the shoe sales in the United States. That's not a monopoly if you only have 7% of a particular firm. Even in the case of Alcoa, which actually was a monopoly, um, it was the only producer of virgin ignot and aluminum in the United States. Its annual profit rate was about 10% after taxes. The price of aluminum went down over the years to a fraction of what it had been before Alcoa was formed. Yet Alcoa was prosecuted under the antitrust laws and convicted, even though prices were going way, way down. Another way of putting it is that sometimes there is a monopoly that exists, but then there are other factors like other products that could be used in the case of aluminum, and that kind of kept Alcoa kind of honest because maybe you could use tin or some other product that was cheaper, wood, plastics, things of that nature. So it's again a lot more complicated on the surface. Another vague standard that a lot of antitrust legislation uses is this idea that, oh, have you how much of the market do you control? Well, that's a very vague standard, and it's sometimes arbitrary in terms of how the court rules on these things, and they're always consider, oh, that they're doing this activity that could create a potential monopoly down the road. So instead of allowing the process to play itself out and actually have real evidence of an actual monopoly, they will convict the firm that's being prosecuted or sued because they are engaged in activity that could produce a monopoly down the road. So again, just to review, I call it the tangled web of antitrust cases. There's a confusion between what is detrimental to competition and what is detrimental to competitors, and there's usually not as much attention paid to consumers and what is good for them. Oftentimes, it's forgotten that big companies have economies of scale that can allow for them to have lower prices, and maybe that's good for consumers. Some examples of antitrust cases involve Morton Salt, Standard Oil, Borden Milk, Microsoft, Kodak, and Alcoa. The problem is sometimes the standard about what control a company has over the market is very difficult and pretty arbitrary to determine. It goes into, again, more cases, more examples. I already mentioned the case of Microsoft and Netscape. There was also on page 169 a, well, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft. We can do that. So this is on page 168. It says, in the famous antitrust case against Microsoft at the turn of the 21st century, for example, the market was defined as that for computer operating systems for standalone personal computers using microchips of the kind manufactured by Intel. This left out not only the operating systems running Apple computers, but also other operating systems such as those produced by Sun Microsystems for computers or the Linux system for standalone computers. In other words, the standard for like the data that they were using to determine whether Microsoft had a monopoly didn't include all these other products where they clearly did not have a monopoly. And so if you added it all up, the entire computer industry, it was very difficult to say that they actually did have a monopoly. In its narrowly defined market, Microsoft clearly had a dominant share. The antitrust lawsuit, however, did not accuse Microsoft of jacking up prices in the classic manner of monopolies. Rather, Microsoft had added an internet browser to its Windows system free of charge, undermining rival browser producer Netscape. So it's this whole idea that, oh, they're undercutting their competitors, and once they drive them out of business, then there'll be nobody to compete with, and then they'll jack up the price. Now again, Netscape is gone, but just the whole nature of the market in computers would suggest that it is highly competitive. And so even though they might, maybe not have a rival firm immediately, the whole notion of technological innovation is so fast today that the idea that they would just, oh, I'm going to now lower my price, drive out my competition, and then increase my price. He also points out that that is a very, very risky way of running a business and usually would backfire. And it's not as common as people make it out to be. He uses the case of Budweiser, controlling, quote unquote, 46% of all beer sales in the United States as controls defined in antitrust rhetoric. In reality, the merger would still leave a majority of the beer sold in the country in the hands of other brewers, of which more than 400 new brewers were added the previous year. And also points out that, some markets don't just stand still. That, if you look at over time, there's actually many, many more brewers now than it was when the case was brought initially to court. It's also a very important point that sometimes monopolies exist within a country, but do they exist within a global free trade system? And that makes it even more unlikely that over time a monopoly is able to be maintained for a long period of time. There's this kind of ridiculous case at the bottom of 169 talking about shoes. The Supreme Court defined the market for shoes in terms of domestic production of non-rubber shoes. Well, so they're not counting sneakers, deck shoes, imported shoes of all kinds. So is that a real accurate criteria for determining whether a firm has control over a certain large percentage of a particular market? Ultimately, determining who controls the market share is difficult and often arbitrary. So hopefully you're getting the idea here. Sometimes there's substitute or alternative products that complicate antitrust charges. He gives the example of newspapers and movie houses where people were being sued, but really no market had been captured by a particular. In fact, for like newspapers, most newspapers are going out of business because people don't read very much anymore, at least traditional forms of print media. Um, he next again goes into the topic of predatory pricing. And we've kind of talked about this already, but just to kind of put a finer point to it, um, the theory is that a big company will undercut its smaller competitors, corner the market in a particular um, kind of product, and then drive out all competitors and then eventually jack up the prices to monopoly levels. However, the reality is that there's been almost zero actual predatory pricing examples that people can point to. On page 172, he quotes Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker when he said, quote, "I do not know of any documented predatory pricing case." And so he gives examples of the A&P grocery chain, the Microsoft Corporation in the 1990s, that almost in every one of these circumstances, it's the opposite of predatory pricing. It's actually the firm that's being sued is actually has the lower price and not the higher price. Page 173, second full paragraph, says that um, predatory pricing is more than just a theory without evidence. It is something that makes little or no economic sense. A company that sustains losses by selling below cost to drive out a competitor is following a very risky strategy. Whether it can and do so and escape the antitrust laws as well is even more problematical. And antitrust laws can lead to millions of dollars in fines or the dismemberment of the company. But even if the would-be predator manages somehow to overcome these problems, it is by no means clear that eliminating all existing competitors will mean eliminating competition, because markets are dynamic. They don't stay the same. And so who's to say that if you drive out some of your competitors that there won't be others that will come into their place? So uh, it sounds evil, right? Predatory pricing. But it really doesn't often work, and it's pretty risky. So again, the theory is that this big company is lowering their prices, but they'll drive out their competition, drive these smaller companies into bankruptcy, and then immediately jack up their prices to monopoly levels. There's very few instances of that actually happening. Most predatory price claims involve claims of future market control given current pricing. But that doesn't mean there's very few examples where you'd see the actual jacking up of the price. Okay. Finally, he talks about the benefits and costs of antitrust laws, and here, he does admit that there is a clear benefit. This is on page 174, that there is a blanket prohibition against collusion to fix prices among firms. So if you are meeting in a back room with another firm in your sector, and you're sitting down and determining what the price will be of something, regardless of the competition, that is an excuse me, that is a no-no, and there are high fines, automatic violations that occur. The question is that is a clear benefit of antitrust legislation, and it's a good thing that it exists. It really does kind of put companies on record for not doing that kind of behavior. But there are some clear costs to acting like this. Antitrust is used to target successful firms often that have lower prices than their competitors, and it's a way for competitors to increase the legal cost of big firms and to try to get into the market. Maybe not because they're making a better product, but because they have better lawyers. And I think that was definitely the case when Netscape sued Microsoft. They didn't have a. I remember specifically. Excuse me. I remember specifically some computers having Netscape, and it was terrible. Nobody liked it, and nobody used it. But because there was this argument, oh well, Microsoft is the only other provider, that they are actually uh, making it easier for their Windows system to be to be loaded up on the computers that they were because most of Microsoft was they were selling hardware, not software. Other companies do it a little bit differently. The point is, um, it's these antitrust laws and this rush to the courts is not so much about stopping monopolists from charging exorbitant prices and reducing the quality of goods. It's actually going against these companies that have large economies of scale that can pass along those discounts to their consumers and their customers, and for that they are being sued in court. And so it's like, well, what the heck's going on here? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He concludes the chapter by going into some details about what goes on in India. Um, in the by the early 90s, most of their economy was highly regulated. Lots of stringent anti-monopoly laws that were he would argue on page 174, that were being counterproductive. They were eventually repealed in 1991, and some of India's leading industrial prevented from expanding their highly successful enterprises lest they exceed an arbitrary financial limit used to define a monopoly, regardless of how many competitors the monopolist might have. As a result, Indian entrepreneurs often applied their efforts and capital outside of India. And again, what Adam Smith would say is that that would decline what? That would reduce the wealth of that particular nation. Um, and so it was only after they repealed much of that legislation that India's economy began to take off. So again, what I hope that you've gotten from these portion of Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 is that there is a thing called monopoly and cartels. They do exist, sometimes naturally, sometimes because they decide to multiple firms decide to collude to fix prices. There are historical examples when that does occur, and there are legitimate reasons for the government to intervene. The problem, according to Sowell, is that that original impetus of these, like, big, you know, um, trusts that had developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, they really haven't been repeated in any kind of real significant way. And even if you had a company like Microsoft that had quote unquote cornered the market on the computer industry, it's highly skeptical that they were actually working against the interest of consumers, because Microsoft was actually selling the product at a lower price. And Sol would argue that it's not enough just to predict that eventually that predatory pricing will drive out competitors, and then eventually that firm will be able to jack up their prices again. There's just not a lot of examples that that happens, and as a result of that, maybe antitrust should be kind of reformed and restricted to its original purpose, as opposed to just a way for competitors to use it as a legal bludgeon against companies that actually have done a pretty decent job of providing services at a lower cost because of the economies of scale that they have developed over time. So that's the end of the lecture. Hopefully you understand that. There'll be Google Forms assignments for both monopolies and cartels, and then antitrust and government regulatory commissions. Okay, so good luck with that. The next lecture will be tomorrow, and we'll be looking at minimum wage. All right, take care. Thank you.